Hi, here is Markku Wilenius, and I'm going to talk about the way the Foresight experts think about the long-term future. Now, in this university where we have been just visiting, and I've had several classes here, I just had an hour or two with my students talking about what will happen in an event after the event itself has happened, and what type of the mid to long-term consequences of any event. Like in our case, it was the Russian-Ukraine conflict. What will happen? So a lot of the talks that we had inside the classroom was about what the students say was the kind of what they see that are sort of a more immediate consequences. Whereas I was trying to teach them that we need to think about more long-term, meaning that we need to think about not just the immediate, but the secondary, tertiary, and even beyond that type of the consequences that usually cascades down in the big global events such as this crisis. Now, this Russia-Ukraine crisis is not, of course, the first crisis that has happened over the decades when the modern kind of a global society with all its interconnectivity has been born out. We have had, for instance, financial crisis. What was the financial crisis about? That was about the long-term consequences of economy that has simply become a toxic one, because there was too many money flooding into one particular market in the economy, which was in the housing economy, mortgages and so forth. And suddenly this became a global phenomenon, which had a lot of long-term consequences for those countries that were not actually the ones in which that crisis happened. And so it is now with this Russia-Ukraine crisis as well. Probably the most significant consequences are to those countries that are very far from the point of conflict. And this is very typical of what happens when this kind of a surprising effects takes place. Something disruptive happens, and then we start to see how it cascades down to the several subsequent consequences. So, for instance, these consequences that happen out of this war might be that a lot of countries in the developing side of the world, which already are struggling with their economy, where people have hardly any money to use for their everyday life, they're gonna be the most effective, because if the rise of the food price increase is rapid, it really dramatically affects today's lives. Even if they are far away from somewhere in Africa, somewhere in South America, somewhere in the distant Asia. And so this is the way the world operates in these very global times in which we are living in. And this is what we need to be taking care of when we think about the aftermath in the long run, in particular, about the crisis like this. Now, one serious aspect of this type of the development is that once we start to look at these cascading effects, we start to see how things actually connect in a very different way. Because we also see the type of the patterns. Now let's take the food, for instance. Food prices have had this type of a highly upward and then downward sort of a dynamic pattern since the last 20 years. Started actually when China became essential part of the global economy, and a lot of demand was coming from the rise of the China, from the rise of the Asia, with a consequence that the food prices and actually many other commodity prices also started to go up. And then afterwards it started to slow down in the early years of 2010 decade, and then it went up again, and then it went down, and now they're going up again in the spring of 2022 as a result of this crisis, because obviously a lot of the commodities, a lot of particularly the food, the grain that is flooding to the global market has traditionally come from Russia and Ukraine. Now, when we think about these type of fluctuations of the market with different reasons being at the time that is actually causing these fluctuations, we need to keep in mind that there must be some sort of pendulum, as it was, that works in the background. And that is very much what I have been working with my own kind of a framework of long-term socio-economic consequences, which is traditionally called Kondratiev waves, because it was the Russian economist Nikolai Kondratiev that 100 years ago detected that indeed there is a certain long-term economic fluctuation that affects economies worldwide. Ever since this kind of a theory of the long-term waves and patterns and fluctuation has become a more particular, because we understand now much more also about the impact of the technology, but also the impact of the politics and culture. And it is very much a combination of these different sectors that then play, always in a bit a new way, a role in how this a dynamic pattern of the economics and of the financial performance and of the society works in general. But since this pattern has been already detected since the beginning of industrialization, so that we have had now full 5 waves there, and now we have entered the 6th wave, and then there is I presume a 7th wave, which is the latter part of this century, and so forth and so forth. So it seems to be that there is some sort of an internal dynamic that is giving this form. And so with that type of the framework, we can also start to see in a different way how this type of the more distant sort of consequences take place after any disruptive event, even if that event itself is a part of the larger picture, how societies evolves and what type of the disruptive elements there are. My strong belief is that as we move forward and the complexity grows in the global economy, we're going to see more and more of this kind of a disruption, simply because there are more interactions, more elements in that system that actually causes that. Which means that we need to be much more prepared in the future for seeing those. And one of the issues that we have seen, particularly with this Russian-Ukraine conflict, is the very fact that we already saw a lot of events preceding this actual war that was sort of leading there. The challenge for us is always that, do we see that kind of a bigger storyline there before it actually kind of is splashed to our eyes in a one way? And for the foresight, we should be able to detect that, so that to detect those kind of a long tails, understand the dynamism behind, and from there to actually to understand how this might evolve, this particular event or this particular development might evolve into the future. So the future is never kind of a purely logical, it's never purely kind of a continuum either. it goes sort of ups and downs because that's the nature of how our future materializes and comes into the present. But the most important thing for us to understand is that we need to be very open, particularly for these far-reaching consequences, to understand that whatever we do in the one spot will affect the other. So it's what is sometimes known as butterfly effect. It's an effect that has these kind of far-reaching consequences. And more we can be looking at those long-term consequences, more we can understand actually the reality as of now, because in a way these long-term consequences are already hidden in the present context, even if it's very hard for us to see that.